This episode of MedSearch Moments was made possible by Hillrom, now part of Baxter. From next-generation smart beds, care communication apps, diagnostics, nutrition, and beyond, they're uniting to save and sustain more lives worldwide. Visit their website at www.hillrom.com. This is Alissa.
And this is Chelsea.
Welcome to MedSearch Moments, the AMSN podcast.
This podcast is an engaging look at the lives of and surrounding medical surgical nurses.
We're proud MedSearch nurses just like you, sharing our stories, insights, and experiences to support you in your nursing journey.
As MedSearch nurses, the physical, mental, and emotional burden of our daily workload impacts us and our patients in many ways, especially when it comes to high-risk patients and patient deterioration. It's what many refer to as the nursing burden. Here with us today to talk about the nursing burden, including solutions, is Kirsten Emmons.
Kirsten Emmons is a nurse leader, inventor, and influencer with Hillrom, which is now part of Baxter International. She focuses on the identification and execution of solutions which contribute to the future of outcome-driven healthcare. Kirsten, welcome to this special episode of MedSearch Moments.
Thank you, Alissa and Parker. It's my pleasure to be here today talking to you about the things that I love most, which is technology development, understanding nurse workflow, and things like cognitive burden that's impacting the way nurses care for patients today and in the future.
Why don't we just start by talking about the contributors that lead to cognitive burden for nurses today in MedSearch?
We are, as a nursing profession, really facing current trends that are really leading to this notion of cognitive burden. This has been a topic that's been near and dear to my heart in my profession as both a nurse executive and leader in the acute care space, as well as in my role at Hillrom, now part of Baxter, where I'm intimately engaged and involved in the development of technologies that support clinicians at the bedside, including the med-surg area. So we all know that there's several trends leading to change in healthcare. So we know we're in a post-pandemic world. We know care practices have changed. We know a little bit more now about regulatory and legal pressures, standards and policies that are impacting how we take care of our patients. Things like nursing staff shortages, the experience level of clinicians at the bedside is changing and evolving as time goes on. We have a more complex aging population that we're dealing with and causing much more acutely ill patients in what is traditionally a med-surg area. But I think when we dial into even some of the contributors of what we've termed cognitive burden, can be bucketed into a few different facets. In some work that we've done within our organization, we bucket these within facets that include emotional impacts on nursing and what's leading to and can cause cognitive burden, social facets of nursing, and patient care facets of nursing. Under emotional facets of nursing and contributors to cognitive burden, I would include things like personal life. Nurses come to work with the burden of their home life, areas that are challenging to them with their children, with their spouses and partners, and they bring that with them to the workplace. And so I feel like that leads to this notion of a burden just as humans, right? Nurses are humans. And so they have those just general emotional ties and concerns in their lives that they're dealing with. In addition to that, nursing has really elevated the notion of caring for others. And we see that impact the way we care for ourselves. So self-care can sometimes be limited within the nursing population. And of course, other buzzwords like burnout and compassion fatigue really are impacting our ability to take good care of our patients. So there are items within that emotional facet of nursing that ring true.
Definitely. I don't think a lot of people really talk about the emotional labor that goes into nursing. We have to support our patients during crises in their lives that often merge with other crises. So it's just like this huge thing on top of social issues they may be experiencing or family issues they may be experiencing. They're also super sick. You take on that emotional weight. We witness our patients crying, other emotions such as anger or frustration. It's definitely something that I've experienced as a nurse is taking on the emotional burden and labor of my patients.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I feel like it's kind of multifaceted because over time as a nurse, you feel really tuned in, I feel like, on what really does need your emotional labor, if that makes sense. So, bringing in a trauma patient, it's out of the ordinary. This person had their life uprooted on the freeway 5 minutes ago versus somebody who had a planned elective surgery. But the way that they could cope with it could be completely different. The trauma person could be rolling with it, the punches a little bit better and require less of your emotional skills of having to comfort and reassure and educate of what's going to happen versus someone who had maybe a planned elective surgery, knew they were coming for 3 months, didn't do the homework, didn't do what they needed to do, and ended up requiring a lot more emotional labor to comfort them and calm their anxieties and all that kind of stuff. So for me, I feel like the emotional labor, the emotional burden that nurses could be doing with patients, sometimes it feels like misplaced too, because personally, I would have that attitude of, man, you had all this time to prepare and we had joint camp for you to go to. And, we had all these things so that you could come here and feel very comfortable and safe in the plan. Meanwhile, I got Joe Blow, who just got thrown off a motorcycle and is dangling from a tree, and he's doing better than you are. So when I think about doing that emotional burden and that emotional labor for patients, that's kind of what comes to mind.
I appreciate that. I started out nursing in medical oncology. So you can imagine that you had those moments of put life in perspective several times during a shift.
Absolutely.
The other facets that we have bucketed these contributors into include social facets. So I find it really interesting when you look at the ecosystem of nursing, we almost create our own mini societies within both a hospital as well as within our profession. So we have different types of societies and cultures that we find ourselves in the middle of. And with that, I think comes our own pressures, our own familial or family dynamics within that small socio setting that we create in our nursing world. I think we also, from a social point of view, are experiencing different levels of clinicians' knowledge, whether that's based on education levels and different education levels all working together and providing somewhat within the same scope and level of care, as well as novice, proficient, and expert nurses. So you can imagine those smaller social facets of nursing or smaller societies of nursing is creating to items like, how do we communicate with each other in this different world? How do we communicate with 4 generations taking care of the same patient or the same group of patients? And how does that impact how we make decisions and who we lean on and get information from? And thirdly, which again, I'm sure you all have lots of examples and items to discuss within, is the patient care facets. So shift work schedules. This notion of anticipating issues with your patients, but never predicting. So we had done some effort around this space of how do you maintain that level of task management and nursing routine while remaining flexible to a challenge or to a change in your patient or your patients. That's a flexibility that honestly taps into our brain a lot of the day. You can currently think about your times during the shift where you have to sit down and regroup and figure out how your plan for the day went to heck, right? And now you have to recalibrate and reprioritize all of your day. We talk a lot about term cognitive stacking and how we change our decisions based on that routine and or the need to adapt to change or be more flexible throughout that day. And then, of course, we have all of the different players we interact with, from physicians to pharmacy to lab personnel to environmental services. And then we have standards and tools and technologies that are thrown at us from every direction. So anything in that area of the actual nurse workforce or social facets that ring true or that you'd like to expand on?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to the cognitive stacking. What do you think are the impacts of that on the nurse's ability to make decisions? Like when you said, having to sit down and reprioritize things, identify high-risk patients, or detect deterioration early?
There's so many trade-offs that have to occur as clinicians throughout a given few moments of their days or the nights of the shift. When you think about the trade-offs that have to happen in your brain as you're making those decisions, all of these cognitive burdens that we've mentioned, or these influencers to cognitive burdens, have to be traded off. And so I have to now rely on my experience to make a decision. Well, if I'm a novice nurse and I don't have that experience, I have to figure out who I can talk to help supplement that experience level and help me understand what's going wrong with my patient. Because they might have that feeling that something's going wrong, but they may not, within that social environment, feel comfortable to talk to someone. And so you can start to see how all of these facets and these contributors really impact our ability to make decisions and really impact our ability to act on our feet or act quickly or respond to changes in our patients or changes in the environment that really could have an impact on patient outcomes. And so I think there's lots of science around how you make these decisions. And part of that is, number one, like I mentioned, rely on experience first, rely on others' experiences. And then sometimes you just got to go with your gut. When you think about actual patient deterioration in a med-surg environment, there's always a risk that we're missing that due to these abilities or inabilities to make these decisions and trade-offs and notice when something's going wrong with the patient. So the task management of the day, just the routine of the day of my medications at this time, my turning every 2 hours, or those types of routines that occur really can get us focused on the routines and make us miss some of those big kind of glaring issues and sometimes subtle changes in our patients until they've already deteriorated to a point that now you're calling maybe a rapid response team or a code blue on that patient. And so I think when we look at technologies and technology development, we really need to look for technologies that are really perceived as tools supporting that nurse's senses, their knowledge, and their behavior. And so by understanding and getting intimate, and hopefully I've shown that in industry, we can be very intentional about understanding those workflows and the drivers of our stakeholders, our users, in this case, med-surg nurses, and making sure that when we develop something, we're developing it in a manner that really supports them in what they already know how to do. And so patient deterioration is one of those topics that we've really spent a lot of time trying to understand and understanding how we can provide earlier intervention when patients seem to be deteriorating, maybe earlier than what we knew.
So when you're thinking about developing a new technology that's going to help with this cognitive burden for the med-surg nurse, how do you ensure that you're able to address these challenges to improve that future state for the nurse? You were saying that you try to align it with things that they're already doing and making it something so it's easy to incorporate into the day or into the workflow. How does one even start to determine what a technology looks like to support that for a nurse?
A lot of effort goes into what we would probably call primary or secondary research out of the gate, right? So we have really bright engineering folks who have no idea what it looks like in a med-surg nurse's world. And so we spend a lot of time just putting them in that world and doing primary investigation. So they work alongside the nurses, alongside the techs in the med-surg area, the unit secretary. Sometimes we just sit them in patients' room and let them understand who comes in and out and how often do they come in and out and how do they interact and what do those interactions lead to? Like what changes because of certain things patients say or do, and what does a nurse do to react to that? And we can start to see patterns of those types of behaviors. We also do in that primary research, lots of interviews with clinicians to say, what's missing? What do you not know? And so many times, Alissa, we hear them say, I had a gut feeling about my patient and I called the physician and they asked me what was going on and I didn't have a way to characterize it. I wasn't able to say, I just know something's wrong with this patient and get them to react with what I needed them to react on. And so then you go back to the drawing board and start gathering more information. And I think in a lot of our primary interviews and discussions, that's what we were finding is there wasn't a gap in folks and clinicians at the bedside thinking there was something wrong with patients from a deterioration point of view. It's that they didn't have anything tangible at that minute to put their finger on. And so the next thing that we really work on and work through is secondary research. So what's the standards say? What does literature say about cognitive stacking and how they make decisions? What do we understand about how they assess patients from head to toe? And what's the difference in proficiencies? So what does a new nurse, a novice nurse, how does she look at the patient and what does she assess versus an expert nurse and what she assesses? And really looking for technologies that are sensing and providing the same types of data that they might collect on their own when they're not in the room. Some of you are familiar, I'm sure, and have been a long time with pulse oximetries. That trend has come up and down, right, at the bedside. And we were actually finding in the literature that pulse oximetry is a late notification of patient deterioration. By the time your pulse ox decreases, you've probably had a few other changes prior to that include heart rate and respiratory rate. And so one of the technologies that we are newer to the market with is that we're able to monitor that heart rate and respiratory rate continuously from the surface of the bed. We have a really fine balance there. Parker, I'm sure you can expand on that. If we give nurses more data and we don't understand how they're going to react to that data, then it's not necessarily going to be utilized. So figuring out a way that now for the first time, we're providing trends in heart rate and respiratory rate that clinicians have not had at the med-surg care area, typically continuously, mostly episodic vital signs, then we really had to put it in the space and just learn. We really had to just take it into a live environment and understand, what does a nurse do when she's notified of this? And how does she act differently if she's notified versus not notified? She can just check it whenever she wants. And so those are the nuances that as we move through new technology development and launching, that we really have to be in tune with the response to what that technology does in that workflow.
How are nurses responding to these new technologies from what you guys have observed? And is it improving patient care?
We have seen improvements in outcomes with the use of continuous heart rate and respiratory rate monitoring in a med-surg area. What we've seen is some earlier identification of patient decline. So ability to be able to call a doc a little earlier with some trended data to say, today, what we would normally have in episodic vital signs is that we would say this morning, their heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, temperature, right, was this. At noon or at 4 p.m., it was these values. Now we're able to say, over the last 4 hours, I've seen an increase in respirations. I've seen a decrease in heart rate or an increase in heart rate. And so we're really able to give that physician a little bit more information about that trend of the patient's condition versus just that episodic notion. And with that has come increased response to visits. We've been able to get nurse practitioners or rounding providers to the units earlier. We've even had instances where we've had rapid response teams called that, quite honestly, when the patient got to ICU, they crashed and it turned into a code. And we had been able to alert that nurse of those trend changes before that code event happened. So some unbelievably emotional stories of young folks who we saw those trends decline, folks that maybe an inexperienced nurse wouldn't have been worried about, or even a proficient nurse may have not been worried about, but something changing a little bit earlier in that decline of care. And then the other thing I would just tell you is anecdotally, there is still an opportunity. We are working really diligently to understand the impact of these continuous vital signs on early warning scores. So early warning scores like Muse and News and SIRS that have been in some waxed and waned with use of them, but they still seem to be relatively supported in the literature for using them as a standard of care. We're really understanding now with our research the impact of continuous vitals to those early warning scores. So again, not just doing a Muse at 8 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 6 in the evening, whatever the shift times are, but actually continually feeding those early warning scores with an updated heart rate and respiratory rate from our device. We're able to, again, give that nurse more context about the changes in those patients than they may have had with just episodic information.
That is so fascinating. I'm curious, and I have no idea if you've looked at your data in this way, but have you seen any differences in how this technology has been looked at from the novice nurse to the expert nurse? Is there a difference in how they look at or use the data that they're able to collect?
We have not. And I think, Alissa, that would be an amazing piece of data to collect. One of our goals when we develop these types of technology is understanding how that data is going to be used by those different proficiencies of clinicians. I have some suspicion, and again, this is not based on current data today, but I have suspicion in my experience that you may have an expert nurse that doesn't rely on that as much as they may have earlier in their career. And maybe that's because their experience makes them feel, quote unquote, okay with this patient. They feel like this patient is safe. And so I tend to believe that providing this more updated, trended information to that novice and proficient nurses may help augment some of that lack of experience or give them that tangible input that they're looking for in order to make decisions about care.
I kind of wondered that same thing, if this would be a great way to support the novice nurse and the proficient nurse. You gain so much of that experience and that confidence in your practice by actually seeing and doing. And so this would be a great adjunct tool for them to see those trends over and over again and see what the patient does on a consistent basis. for them to start building that confidence in what they can expect. And so what a great supplement. And then you never know. I mean, you may have nurses that really do continue to rely on it as they gain that experience, and other nurses that are like, no, I feel very confident. I don't need it anymore. So I was just curious which direction that might go in for you. So
yeah,
I will be curious to see if you guys look into that in the future.
Absolutely. We're all anxious to understand that again, and just because it's so important to understand how any technology sensing is being utilized. Listen, we have to be very cognitive of our own impact on cognitive burden with those technologies and the amount of technologies that clinicians are interfacing with during their shift, including where they go to find that information. So a little bit about the same type of monitoring, where do we send it? And again, I mentioned, do we just provide it at the bedside, which some hospitals has chosen to leave it at, and others send it to be in an alert or something visually they can see on their mobile device when they need to look at it. So those are also the types of embodiments of that data and where we send it to, and again, ensure that those nurses can make decisions that are appropriate.
I think it will be interesting to see how you guys start attempting to decrease cognitive burden with the amount of technology usage on the unit. I find it comforting to know I can quickly glance at news scores and use scores in addition to my nursing assessment and using my best nursing judgment. But it's really nice to have those alerts there. The unit I currently work on is a med-surg trauma unit. So a lot of our patients have telemetry, and we have telemetry folks who monitor. That's all they do. It's monitor telemetry. So I'll get a call saying, hey, your patient is throwing a bunch of PVCs, or hey, this patient's an AFib, or, they've had 6 beats of VTAC. It's comforting because I can make a time of that, type my note in, knowing that we have a monitor room and telemetry. It's nice. You can just get a call on that phone and, they can let me know what's going on with my patient.
Parker, you make a great point. There's this notion of just knowing somebody's got your back. And by somebody, it may be a person who's doing the monitoring. It may be a technology who's doing the monitoring, or alerts or alarms that are helping you ensure that you're answering requests timely or knowing when a bed exit's happening. So I think it's really interesting, the point you make around it is comforting to know that there is just something that can help alert me if I'm with another patient, right? Or I'm dealing with another issue.
Are there any other technologies that you want to summarize that you guys have been working on?
Hillrom as a whole in the med-surg area has been really focused on sensing information about the patients. So we are a traditional bed company is how we started as Hillrom. And so we have felt for years that we have a lot of real estate hosting that patient on our surface, that there's so much more patient information we can learn and share with clinicians appropriately. The next realm of that is not just sensing more information about the patient. So we can now currently tell you a heart rate and respiratory rate with our Centrella medical surgical bed platform. We can tell you about incontinence events. So we can detect moisture utilizing a pad on that bed, similar to an incontinence pad that folks would use today, but this one's smart. So we can actually tell you both via alarm and alerting, or just a light under the bed, that there's been an incontinence event with that patient, and that could impact their skin health, being in moisture. We can tell you the bed exit alarms and when they're getting out of bed so that you can respond appropriately if they're fall risk. But in addition to that, we really have spent a lot of time bringing companies alongside us that are able to communicate that data appropriately. So we have a nurse call system that can stratify those alarms and figure out who to send them to, alongside a mobile app that then routes it to the appropriate caregivers, to wherever those caregivers are and whenever they need that information. So I think as we move forward, you can see a lot more intention, not just collecting pieces of data, because we'll always be looking for other items that we can sense, but it's also how do we communicate these insights to the right caregivers at the right time so that they can make, again, care decisions that are appropriate for that patient in a manner that can improve outcomes as well. So I would say that we will spend a lot more time capitalizing on our care communications portion of our business so that we can get smarter and get more involved in that actual workflow of that data, not just sending the data somewhere. So I would say that's a more futuristic view of what we'll tend to focus on. On the other side of that, we now are a part of Baxter, who has things like IV pumps and dialysis machines. So we're working both internal to Baxter, but external of how do we again start having all of these devices work together? And can we get you the information you need consolidated, not just from this app or not just from that app? And that may not be us, but we may all be working towards sending it to, again, that right place at the right time.
That is awesome. Here at our organization, we opened up a new medical rehabilitation center about a year or two ago. And I remember getting all those tours on all the beds with the sensors and integrated into the call light system. And they push this button for water and it'll go to your aide, and they push this button for meds and it'll go to the nurse. And you know what? All of that is so helpful in making sure that the patient's requests are being met and dealt with in a timely manner, and that the staff is not being burdened for anything that's not appropriate for them. And so I just remember thinking how amazing that technology is. So awesome. That's coming down the line. Really appreciate that.
Well, thank you both for allowing me to share both my experiences in working for an industry partner to clinicians at Hillrom and how we develop technologies appropriate to the caregivers. And you all are the reason that my company and that my job exists, so that we can make sure that we're serving and keeping yourselves and the patients at the forefront of our minds as we develop technologies.
Oh, so helpful, so important. Kirsten, it's truly been a pleasure having you on this important episode of MedSurg Moments. Thank you so much for your time and expertise and knowledge on all of this information. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We do look forward to connecting with you on our next episode of MedSurg Moments, the AMSN podcast. In the meantime, we want to hear from you. Send us your questions, topic ideas, and feedback via our official MedSurg Moments email address. That's amsnpod@amsn.org. That's amsnpod@amsn.org.
We'd also like to remind you to become a member of the Academy of Medical Surgical Nurses or review your membership at www.amsn.org. You receive lots of cool benefits and perks, such as discounted pricing on the annual convention and continuing education.
We encourage you to help us spread the word and subscribe to the MedSurg Moments podcast via your smartphone podcast app to receive notifications of future episodes. Please be sure to leave us a review and recommend MedSurg Moments wherever you get your podcasts to help us reach even more listeners.
We invite you to join the conversation by sharing your ideas and questions on AMSN's Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter pages. And don't forget to add #MedSurgMoments to your post. Simply enter AMSN on the search field of any of these social media platforms to connect with us.
The content within the MedSurg Moments podcast represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the co-hosts and may not necessarily reflect the views, thoughts, and opinions of the Academy of Medical Surgical Nurses. Until next time, I'm Alissa.
I'm Chelsea, and always remember, MedSurg Moments is a moment in our lives, a moment in our MedSurg careers that makes a huge difference.